So a number of objectives for this. One is just understanding how campaigns work and the steps involved in planning a campaign. Also understanding that the foundation of campaigns needs to be people, especially people most impacted by an issue and partners. And that relationship building is a really, really key part of any campaign. And then finally, understanding how if we are centering people, we're going to be creating multi-issue powerful campaigns that result in community change and aren't just focused on one issue. Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to have a little group discussion so people can use the chat box, and then would love to hear from a few folks. Want to talk about the idea of power. And we have a spectrum here, and if you can put in the chat box, you can put a 5 if you're power hungry. You can put a 1 if the idea of power makes you uncomfortable, or you might be somewhere in the middle, so 2, 3, or 4, depending on where on the spectrum. Great, thank you everyone for sharing. I'm wondering if 1 or 2 people can share why they put the number that they put. And I don't know if this involves trying to get people off mute. No. I will leave it to our technical people to help with that.
Yeah, if anybody would like to share, you can either type that into the chat, you can, or you can use the raise your hand function if you've logged in online, and then I can unmute you. And if you have joined by phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand. And yeah, *9.
And do people have to raise their hand to be taken off mute?
Yeah,
okay, cool.
That'll help
Can we
us
tell
manage
people
it.
how to do that?
Yes, let's see. There's a little arrow somewhere.
Looks like Paul is sharing in the chat. He just it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think to go off mute, you click on the participants thing at the bottom, and then a window pops up, and you can press raise your hand, just for folks who do want to participate.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so I saw Paul in the chat box. I put 4 because I think it's necessary for change, but I've never felt I was in a position of power or influence. Susan says, power is a broad term. My desire is mostly to be effective, compelling, etc. Anyone else want to share? Okay, cool. Well, we can go on to the next slide. So now we're going to do the same thing, but with justice. So if you are hungry for justice, put a 5. If the idea of justice makes you uncomfortable, put a 1. And if you're somewhere in between, you can put 2, 3, 4. You can add some decimal points if you want. Ooh, we're seeing a lot of 5s. Great. Does anyone want to share why they're putting the number they're putting, either in the chat box or by raising your hand? I hear, justice seems like apple pie to me. Anyone else want to share? Have you seen a 4-year-old scream, "It's not fair"? Yes, relatable. Okay, cool. Well, we can go on to the next slide. Why wouldn't anyone want justice? Good question, Nicole. So in organizing, we define power as the ability to act, and we think of it as something that's neutral. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And if we want justice, we need power. There are a lot of complex ideas within this, and I hope we can explore this together. A lot of organizing is about building power together. And a lot of times people are scared of unilateral power for understandable reasons, because that's not power together, that's unilateral power. But like right now, no one on this Zoom call is powerful enough. We need to be really, really power hungry when we think about all of the threats to our environment, all of the ways that people are suffering right now in this moment, both because of the way we treat our environment, but also just because of the way we treat people. I would love for anyone on this Zoom call to be president rather than our current president. And the wrong people are power hungry right now. So we need to be power hungry together so that together we can build a more just world. And that's not easy. It's not always super morally clear. It's like pretty complex, but we need to be power hungry if we want justice. And that is like a fundamental idea behind organizing, because there is such an imbalance of power in the world. Next slide. So I love this graphic to describe what organizing is. When we're not building power together, we get eaten by the big scary fish. But when we are building power together, we can hold that fish accountable and take care of each other. I'd love to hear if people have like entities or people they have in mind when you think about this big predatory fish that's ganging up on the little fish. You can put it in the chat box. Yeah, the government, Trump, yeah, oil and gas, corporations, yeah, that dismantling of the EPA, capitalism, Exxon, yeah. So there are a lot of really powerful interests that don't prioritize people or prioritize the planet, and that's why we need to work together. And a fundamental thing about this effective fish that's organized is relationships. So relationships are the building blocks of organizing. They're the building blocks of building power together around shared values. So go to the next slide. Thank you. So relationships are super important, but there's also just different ways to build relationships, and want to think about two different types of relationships. One is transactional, one is transformational. I would ask people to read this out loud, but I realize getting off mute is hard. So I'll go ahead and read it. So on the left, we have transactional. Urgent, driven by desire to get yes. See person or constituency as useful or strategic to reach goals, needs action taken. And transformational, respect, humble, curious, patient, gathering and sharing information, opinions, listening and seeking guidance. Transactional is a one-way flow. We educated on a specific issue. Transformational is two-way, both gathering and sharing information. Transactional is short-term based on policy or issue cycle. Transformational, long-term based on building trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Transactional is really focused on the action. Transformational on the relationship. Transactional, you might take action in support of a partner's activities or grant money to a partner organization. Transformational is when you're jointly planning, implementing campaign plans together. Transactional might be granting money to a partner organization, and transformational, raising money together. So those are a few examples of like transactional versus transformational. And I think it's kind of a spectrum. And I have definitely spent times in my organizing life very much on the transactional side of things, which there are going to be transactional parts of organizing no matter what, but it is less effective and less enduring. And we want to be working towards building transformational relationships with each other, because that's how we can build power together. That's how we can have those trusting relationships to be the big, powerful fish that takes on ExxonMobil or capitalism or corporations. And I think this is a useful thing to keep in mind when doing organizing, and also when thinking about campaign plans. A lot of times the transformational side might take more time, but is going to bring better results in the long run. And again, this is not exclusive. There's still going to be transactional parts of organizing. You know, you're still going to go door to door and get petitions signed. But the goal is that hopefully some of those people you call, you invite to a meeting, they come, and then you can like start to build a more transformational relationship with them and have a one-on-one and build, you know, together, become stronger leaders, etc. So that's a little bit about relationship building. We can go on to the next slide. And again, we're going to be getting to campaign planning soon, but just covering some basics. One thing we want to keep in mind with campaign planning is that the problems are all connected. So the symptoms of systems that serve to accumulate wealth and power in the hands of a few are all connected. So we see this Venn diagram where like racism and social injustice overlaps with broken democracy, overlaps with economic inequality, overlaps with climate change. I'm curious if people can maybe name examples of things that have happened, are happening in the world where we see those issues overlapping. And if you want to share out loud or chat in the chat box.
Well, since I can't unmute myself as a host, I think one of the examples of this happening is right now how COVID is affecting Black populations the most. And it's really exposing the inequalities in society and exacerbating that phenomenon.
Absolutely. Yeah, and hearing that reflected in the chat box. Anything else? Yeah, fossil fuel executive donations, think tanks and lobbyists. Yeah, where we see sort of like broken democracy and climate change overlapping. The military budget. Yeah, a lot of that is overlapping there. If we think about like the military's impact on pollution, like it's huge. Like the military pollutes a lot and then hurts people, and you know, generally the US isn't going to Europe and sending drones there. They're going to places where there are brown people and sending drones there. So that's where it overlaps with racism. And then broken democracy, if we think about the military's role in overturning democratically elected leaders, or like the military, the broader military, the CIA. And then economic inequality. A lot of times I'm thinking about that within the US, but if we think about it across the world, it's huge. Another thing in the chat box, southeast side of Chicago, minority neighborhoods most negatively impacted by harmful factory pollution. Absolutely. Yes, a lot of real examples for this Venn diagram. The next slide. So the problems are all connected, but also the solutions are connected. So we want to be building solutions that are in this overlapping part of the Venn diagram where like cooperation, democracy, inclusion, regeneration are all overlapping. And you can see these arrows, like we want to move from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, from control to democracy, from exclusion to inclusion, from accumulation to cooperation. I would also say like from accumulation to redistribution, but that's probably part of cooperation. So if we implement solutions that are on the edge of some of these circles where it doesn't overlap, we're not going to get real solutions. But the more we're able to get solutions that are in the overlapping part, the more we can like start to just create really powerful systemic change that makes people's lives better. I'm curious if people can think of some solutions they've seen where they see parts of these circles overlapping. And you can share in the chat box or share out loud. Yeah, so I heard ask if, for a repeat of the question. You know, so I asked for examples of problems where in the world where we see the problems overlapping, and now I'm curious if people can name solutions where they see some of the solutions overlapping. I will share one example, and I'll do a like, this is what we don't want, but this is what we do want. Okay, oh, someone shared circular economy, solidarity with underrepresented groups versus arguing over whose issues, whereas, yeah, that's real. maybe some of the efforts that Move On proposes. Thank you for sharing. One example that I think of that I think is, we talk a lot about in environmental circles is with like regeneration. How do we build a clean energy economy? And if we're on like the left side of this, where we're implementing solutions that aren't in the overlapping areas, we're just being like, let's get to 100% clean energy now. However we need, let's just build like giant industrial sized wind farms and solar farms. And that's, the only thing we're going to do, and it's all going to be owned by like the same giant corporation. So that would be an example where like we are going to deal with like some of the short-term climate change stuff, but we're not going to be in this middle area where we can really get to deep solutions and start to like have people everywhere economically benefit from this, have people have control over their power, etc. And so like one example, and this is, again, a lot of these solutions, no solution is like a silver bullet, but a lot of these solutions are just like stepping along the way. Like when we passed the Future Energy Jobs Act, there was stuff there around like solar for all and build like solar training programs, etc. And so that was trying to move the solutions from like the left side of this regeneration side more towards the middle. Let me see if there's anything else in the chat box. Yeah, Ready for 100 community engagement process. CEJA, yeah, with CEJA, we're trying to like more move towards the middle and have some of these solutions all connected. Thanks for sharing. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about campaigns. And I guess the reason we were looking at those circles is we can't get to those solutions without relationships. So that's the thing to keep in mind. So campaigns, this is what this is about. Campaigns are a series of planned actions that take the resources you currently have or can gain access to and turn them into the power you need to get the change that you want. And traditionally in organizing, we think of resources as organized people and organized money, and you need both in order to create change. Next slide. And if we're planning campaigns, we need to think strategically. So we need a plan. We want to know, what are we trying to win and how are we trying to win it? Next slide. Campaigns, we want them to engage stakeholders and partners. So again, they're built on relationships, built on people's needs. They're iterative over time. So a lot of times you'll make an initial campaign plan and then need to revisit it and change it as situations change. They're both narrative and written. So it's really good to have a written campaign plan where you're like, this is who our target is, this is what we're trying to win. But also if the people you're working with don't have like a living understanding of how you're making change, you're not going to be able to really work effectively together. So it should also be narrative, like people should be able to explain the basics of the campaign strategy to each other. And having both of those is important. And then finally, it's sequential. So, you want to plan when you're going to do things. It goes like one after another. Next slide. And so when we're thinking about campaign planning, we like to think about it as a house, and you need a really strong foundation. So the foundation of any campaign should be communities that are impacted by the issue you're working on and internal and external partners. From there, you can identify what your goals are, what your values are, your primary target, so who has the power to give you what you want, your secondary targets and target audiences, so people who can influence that primary target, your messaging, how you're talking about this, and your tactics, what you're literally doing. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about each part of this house, but it's like building a house. You can't start, a lot of times people want to start with the tactics, and it's like, you can't, you need to start with thinking about the people, like who are you working with, who's impacted, and then figuring out what you want and going from there. Next slide. So for planning a campaign, you want a campaign process that's going to be inclusive, because that way you can more be towards the center of the Venn diagram and really get solutions that are going to cut across issues and impact people's lives in the right ways rather than just continuing an inequitable system. So you want to start with conversations with impacted communities and with, the partners you're working with. Next slide. And then I sometimes find like this circle to be a helpful thing to think about, like who should we be talking to? It's just like a list of like different types, groups that might be in a community. You could add things to this circle, but think about like when you're thinking about working on an issue, who's impacted most by the issue, who has a stake in this issue, and think about who you already have relationships with, who you should be working proactively with and planning together. And where do you want to be building more relationships to make sure it can be a really inclusive process? Next slide. So to illustrate each of these building blocks, I'm going to talk about a campaign I was involved with. This was probably like the first big campaign I was really involved in when I was in college. It was the Chicago Clean Power campaign that was working to retire the 2 coal-fired power plants in Chicago. There were lots and lots of groups and people involved in this campaign. And so just like want to acknowledge the huge community effort that this was. I was able to be involved in the broader coalition working on it as a student who was working with other college students across the Chicago area, and we were able to work with all the different groups who were working on it. So that was my experience with this campaign, and I'm going to talk about sort of what the campaign parts looked like for this campaign, but also recognize there might be other people on this call who are involved too, and if they want to chime in with additional perspectives, would welcome that. So next slide. So this campaign was working to retire the 2 coal plants in Chicago, the Fisk coal plant in Pilsen and the Crawford coal plant in Little Village. And if we think back to that campaign planning house, in this slide, we're thinking about impacted communities, who was most impacted by the problems around this coal plant, especially regarding pollution. Most impacted were residents in these neighborhoods, but also workers who worked in the coal plant. And then also impacted Chicago area residents, future generations, the world because of the climate impacts. So as part of this planning and this work, we wanted to be working with as many people in those impacted communities as possible. Many of these people were at the table. One group that I want to acknowledge wasn't really at the table was workers. And this is always this is very frequently a challenge when it comes to addressing polluting infrastructure in communities where there is a lot of interest in being able to work with workers, but a lot of times it's really hard to get to the table together. But that doesn't mean you can't still prioritize issues for workers, even if they're not at the table. So next slide. And then partners, who else was involved? So environmental justice groups were involved, especially as impacted communities. So in Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization, and in Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. And those groups were really the groups that started this campaign. They'd been trying to address pollution from these power plants for a really long time. But then there were all these groups from all across Chicagoland that, where we were all able to work in coalitions. There were Big Greens, there were student groups, there were public health groups, faith groups, a union representing nurses, social justice groups, etc. Next slide. The things that we wanted the coal plants retired. We wanted a transition plan for the workers, and we wanted a community benefits agreement for the communities that these plants were in, to, in a very small way, try and repair the damages of years and years and years of pollution. Next slide. So those were, the communities, the partners, the goals, then the values. This is another part of the house. So some of the values that I kind of heard us talking a lot, one was justice, so environmental and climate justice. Another was fairness and equity. So some communities were suffering more from the pollution than others, and that was fundamentally unfair and inequitable. And then finally, democracy, talking about how communities, not corporations and politicians, should have a say when it comes to their health and the future of our shared planet. So those were some of our shared values that held us together as a coalition. Next slide. So then you want someone has a question in here. What is contained in a community benefits agreement? Who drafts this? That is a great question. In this case, the community benefit agreement was, as I recall, money from Midwest Generation, who owned these coal plants, that was granted to community organizations to just be like, hey, we know we kind of weren't the best neighbors for a long time. Here's some money to kind of make up for it. But it can look different ways. And a lot of times community benefits agreements are actually for when something comes in. This was kind of unusual to have it for when like something moves out of the community. Okay, back to the, so we knew what we wanted, we knew why we wanted it. We needed to figure out who had the power to give it to us. And in this case, our primary target was the mayor. Initially, Mayor Daley was the target. And then midway through the campaign, there was an election and Mayor Emanuel was the target. The reason they were the primary target was because they had the power to either bring the corporation to the table to negotiate a retirement date, or we also had, what's the word for it? Not a resolution, an ordinance. An ordinance we were trying to pass that would have basically forced a closure of these coal plants. And because of how Chicago City Council worked, where like it was a very mayor-heavy situation, the mayor kind of had the ability to get that ordinance passed or not. So those were our primary targets, was the mayor. Next slide. And then secondary targets. These are targets that can influence your primary target. So aldermen were targets, especially Solis and Cardenas, who were the aldermen for where these coal plants were located. A lot of times aldermen and the mayor don't want to really comment on an issue that is like not in their ward, where the alderman in that ward isn't taking action. So it was important to get those aldermen on, but also hard because they had really close relationships with the corporation that owned these coal plants. And then Midwest Generation was also a secondary target, the company that owned the coal plants, just because the more we could make them look bad, the more aldermen and the mayor wanted to look good in contrast and look like they were taking action. So that was how those people could influence our primary targets. Next slide. So when you have your target, you want to think about how to move them, how to get them from, you know, either opposition to neutral or neutral to pro. And self-interest is a really important part of this. Self-interest is an individual's priorities, kind of when you think of self among others. So there's selfishness, there's selflessness, and self-interest is kind of in the middle, where it's like, what do you care about? What impacts you? What values do you hold deep, like so deeply that you would probably like risk or sacrifice a lot for them? And then I think another thing to recognize is frequently a self-interest for elected officials is re-election. So that's the thing you want to be thinking about, is like, what is in our target self-interest? And then another building block of the house is secondary audiences. So these are potential constituencies who can support your goal and influence your target. Messaging is how you frame your goal. How do you talk about this with the public? And then tactics is how do you mobilize your resources to demonstrate your power or convey a message. Next slide. So actually, a lot of the tactics we used, there are all sorts of fun tactics: petitions, photo petitions, press conferences, lobby meetings, civil disobedience, human billboards, endorsements, bird dogging, call-in days, billboard and CTA ad campaign, people's hearing, public art, die-in, etc. Next slide. And here are some pictures of us doing the tactics, some of the tactics. Next slide. And then our messaging. So our messaging was actually a little bit different than our values. So we frequently talked about how these coal plants needed to clean up or retire. Most groups in the coalition did not want a cleanup, which was, I'm putting quotes because it was like basically switching over to natural gas. And most groups were like, that's not clean. But also at this point, it was not 2020, it was like 2011, 2010. When they polled Chicago, most people didn't respond well to these coal plants need to retire, but they responded well to these coal plants need to clean up or retire. And we were pretty confident that if they were ordered to clean up, they would just retire. So like, this is a situation where you need to like navigate your values, where it's confusing, because in some ways you want to be able to change dialogue, and maybe by just leading with these coal plants need to retire, that would change people's thinking that would force people to change their thinking. But we weren't confident of that. And so we were like, let's do the thing that builds the most political goodwill, and that will help us win. But it's like, and by having these coal plants retire, maybe that will get people to a point where they're okay with retiring polluting infrastructure. But it's a tricky thing to navigate. So like that's a place where like our values and messaging weren't necessarily aligned. Some of the other messaging we talked about was how these coal plants were the single largest point sources of carbon pollution in the city. They were 2 of the dirtiest coal plants in the country. They caused 40 premature deaths every year, and the pollution was impacting communities, economically disadvantaged communities and communities of color the most. So that was some of our messaging. Next slide. And then another thing with messaging is thinking about how you're pushing your target. This is a useful little graph to think about how you want to be approaching your target with messaging. If the target is with you and the public's with you, you can do hero messaging. You can be like, come on, Governor Pritzker, we're so excited for you to be a clean energy champ and pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act. If the target is not with you, but the public is with you, you can do a pressure campaign. A lot of times this is what people default to initially, but you actually want to be thoughtful and make sure the target really is against you before you turn to a pressure campaign, because that's going to like kind of mess up relationships if they're not actually against you yet. And then, but also you don't want to be tricked by them, because sometimes they're like, because you're being mean to me, I'm not going to do this. And it's like, well, no, you weren't with us anyway. So anyway, it's tricky. And then if the target is with you, but the public is against you, then you want to be creating political cover for them. And then if the public is against you and the target's against you, you might not want to run a campaign. That being said, there's a lot of things that need to be changed about the world. So I don't want to say never say never. Yeah, these are the different types of messaging and like approaches you can use. I think like an example of, sometimes I like to give examples, like an example of a political cover campaign was actually the Keystone Pipeline campaign targeting President Obama. Like when you did polling, actually most Americans were like, yeah, let's build the Keystone Pipeline, which is depressing, I know. But that campaign was focused on making it look like Obama had no choice because his base was absolutely against the Keystone Pipeline. It was like focusing on his campaign messaging and how his campaign messaging would have been in line with stopping the Keystone Pipeline. So it was creating political cover for him, where he could be like, I have no choice. I'm gonna like lose my electoral base if I say yes to this pipeline. Anyway, I like giving examples of political covers campaigns because those can be a little confusing. Next slide. So I made this little graph of like the targets, their self-interest, who the secondary audiences were, who influenced them, the messaging we used, and like what the most effective tactics were. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll start with like Mayor Daley. Initially, it was like, maybe we could do a hero campaign because he was really interested in his environmental legacy. And yeah, his self-interest was his legacy because he was retiring. And he did kind of seem to care about the environment and climate. Secondary audiences, people who could influence him, were Chicago residents and aldermen. The messaging initially was like hero messaging. It was like, maybe he can do the right thing. He didn't. So then it moved to pressure messaging, like, Mayor Daley, don't you care about your green legacy? Like, what are you doing? So tactics we did, one was a people's hearing when we couldn't get an actual hearing in City Hall. We had a friendly alderman reserve City Council for us and had a people's hearing and did it where we were like, we're not getting a real hearing, so we're just gonna come and say our piece. Another thing that happened, people like made a big sign that was like, is this your green legacy, Mayor Daley, and attached it to balloons and like let it loose in City Hall. So then it was like floating up there, and then there was just this sign in City Hall. Like deliver a coal delivery or deliveries to aldermen that were like coal or candy at Christmas time to pressure aldermen. So those were a few things. I'm not going to go through everything, but like that's one example. Next slide. So a few lessons learned from this campaign, from my perspective. So one is like, if you build it, they will come. Sometimes like it's unclear what to do, but just like making a plan for what you're going to do next, and people want to take action, so we'll come and get involved. Another is like create an equitable and transparent decision-making process for the coalition. There was like a lot of work put into this coalition to make sure people knew how decisions were made, and that everyone had a voice. Adjust your goals and structures as like more stakeholders come to the table and the campaign progresses. So this definitely happened. Like at one point, an MOU was created for every coalition member to like really try and create that trust and accountability within the coalition. Knowing your values, a lot of times you face hard decisions where you're having to, you know, balance your values against each other. And the more you know them, the easier it is to make those decisions. Build and plan a campaign that creates ample room for many leaders, both in executing tactics and making strategic campaign decisions. So just making sure there's a lot of room for people to get involved and making sure people have a space, not just to like do things, but also have a voice in the campaign. Elections are an opportunity to change expectations of our elected officials. And then different organizations can deliver different tactics. So like Greenpeace and Rainforest Action Network were part of this coalition, and they would do a lot of direct actions that like a group like Sierra Club probably wasn't going to do. But then likewise, Sierra Club could endorse candidates, which a lot of groups couldn't do. And that was sometimes really helpful for getting them on our side. And then like everything in between, you know, there were all sorts of different groups and they could really deliver in different ways. And then finally, this is, I'm sorry, the depressing part of the presentation is campaigns are never done. So right now, as some of you might know, the Crawford coal plant in Little Village is like in the process of becoming a distribution site, which is not really a just transition. There's going to be a lot of diesel polluting trucks, not good standards for workers, et cetera. And Little Village Environmental Justice Organization has really been working to create accountability and find a way to make the situation not as shitty as it is. So I'd encourage people to, you know, follow them on social media, amplify stuff you're seeing about this campaign, because unfortunately, like for this site, you know, this is really not a just transition. And so recognizing that even once you think you've won, you haven't won yet. And we see this with so many campaigns, like some of the most iconic campaigns end up just like not staying if we're not always organizing. You know, I think of like the Voting Rights Act and what the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act a number of years ago. And like, that was like one of the most iconic organizing wins in the 20th century. And it was just taken away by the Supreme Court, which makes me really pissed. So anyway, we always need to be organizing so we can always be winning. Next slide. So once again, here is the foundation of campaign planning. And then next slide. And if you're starting a campaign, or even maybe if you're midway through a campaign, it's worth thinking about who is most impacted by the issue you're working on and making sure to be pulling different groups to the table and making decisions together. Next slide. So this is my email address, super happy to answer any questions. And then I'm happy to take questions from the chat box or have room for discussion or whatever makes sense.
I wanted to flag one for you in the chat box, Caroline. Sarah asked, what is bird dogging and what about human billboard?
Yeah,
some tactics that you
totally.
mentioned. Yeah.
So bird dogging, oh, I think I was at one point told the etymology of this term and I forget it, but is when you like show up where you know a politician is going to be and ask them questions. So we actually see a lot of this, you know, the primary season before there was COVID, you saw a lot of this where there would be like politicians who activists might go and ask like, hi, I'm undocumented. Like, what are you going to abolish ICE? Or like, you know, ask like, will you refuse to take money from fossil fuel corporations for your campaign or that type of thing. So that's the example of it during the primaries, but you can do this, like, you can plan for this if you're working on a campaign and you have an elected official who you really want to take action on stuff. I think this happened a lot, you know, New York State banned fracking, and Governor Cuomo was like a huge target of that for years. And actually, like when they announced that they were banning fracking, he was like, I gotta tell you, everywhere I went, there were anti-fracking people telling me to ban fracking. I could not go anywhere without seeing you people. So like, that's bird dogging. It's like following, like finding where politicians are gonna be and asking them questions. And then the other question, oh, the human billboard. I had a picture of that in the presentation. It's like, you can get posters where each poster says like a letter and have people stand and be holding, kind of like in a sports game, be holding like a sign. So we had, I think ours said like, you know, move Chicago off coal, and we had people stand on the side of City Hall and each hold a different sign. And then an MOU is a memorandum of understanding. It's like a fancy legal document, but it was kind of for like a thing people could sign, and you could do something less fancy than this. You could just have like coalition norms where it's like, here's what's expected of coalition members, here's what we expect around privacy and how we treat each other and what decision making looks like, and everyone signs that so that there's just like this shared understanding of like how we interact with each other and make decisions together. Any other questions?
Yeah, Sally just asks if bird dogging can damage relationships.
Yeah, but I think you do it when you don't have a relationship, you know, or don't have enough of one. It's like you do it if you're not able to get a lobby meeting. Yeah, but you know where their favorite coffee shop is, you know, have constituents show up and be like, hi, like, why aren't you doing blah, 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 etc. And a lot of times I think usually like, I think the one way you see this a lot is in like places where, like in town hall meetings where politicians are already doing questions and answers. So if you're especially concerned, doing it in that context makes a lot of sense because it's like, this is already a venue where this is supposed to be happening. But yeah, it totally can. And there's also just like different types of campaigns, which is interesting. Like I think about some campaigns where like the inside game is really vital. And then some campaigns where people are like, we're going to give up on the inside game because we know these people do not care about us or our priorities at all. And we are just going to go hard on the outside game and not let them rest. And like, that can also produce wins. And I don't know, some of the coolest campaigns I think sometimes are ones that just like really lean into the outside game and just like do not quit.
Yeah, so Caroline, thank you again for being on here and helping walk us through organizing. People can continue to put questions in the chat, but I also have one, especially to how to build that foundation when developing a campaign plan. What do you do if you're trying to get the support of the most impacted communities and they're slightly resistant, or you're just not relating to them in a way that's necessary to build that relationship to develop a campaign plan?
For sure. So I think there's a few things. One, a lot of times this has to do with resources and just like, do like organizations in those communities, are they resourced to work on this work? And sometimes like that can be part of the resistance. And then, wait, what was the other thing I was gonna say? Oh, and then I also just recognizing that like no community is a monolith. And like, you know, during this campaign, there were the environmental justice groups in Hilton and Little Village, but there were also a lot of community groups that, you know, weren't really engaged. And it's a really tricky situation where like Midwest Generation was like funding a lot of these organizations because these organizations need funding to do their like social service work, et cetera. And then that, you know, that created really tricky situations too. And that's part of like what's so messed up about these situations, you know, about corporate power in the US. And then I think the final thing is also sometimes like you just like need to take more time to build, like maybe it's not actually a campaign that needs to happen right now. And maybe taking some time to like find out what those organizations are doing, what campaigns they're working on, and just working on them with them on the campaigns they're working on, and kind of doing it with zero expectations, but just in the interest of relationship building and learning more. So those are a few thoughts I have.
Yeah, I would also agree with the relationship building point. But speaking of resources, we do have a question in the chat about the impact of money, both how it impacts when organizers have it and when they don't have it.
Yeah,
just
totally. I'm wondering if you can, if there's like anything more specific there that you're curious about, Jeff. Are you thinking about it on like the organization side or more on the like volunteer side, or?
So like, you know, the right claims that George Soros is paying people to demonstrate. I know that's a bunch of garbage, but, you know, I know it depends on the tactics, but when we have money as organizers, what's the best way for us to use it? And then when we don't have money, like what are the tactics we typically take when we don't have money? If that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. I'm actually not quite sure how to answer it, so I'd be curious to hear from other organizers and or just advocates, other people on this call who have perspectives.
Anyone maybe want to raise their hand so we can take you off mute, or you can also just put what you think in the chat box right now. Like the question is, what should organizers do when they have money and resources to spare? Basically, what do you do when you don't?
Oh, okay. I guess actually maybe I do have a way to answer this, Jeff. I think I still wasn't fully following it, but it's like, if you are a funded organizer, your job is to organize people who are not organizers, but who are volunteers, you know, like, and so like a lot of the job of an organizer is just to pull more people in, and create community and create shared decision-making spaces. And like, this is not about like being like a professional. This is about just like creating a movement together. So I would be like, yeah, if your job is being an organizer, your job is pulling in people who like aren't organizers for their day job, or maybe are, but want to like work on this outside of what they already organize on. And then if you aren't a paid organizer, I would say that's also your job, is to pull in more people. Like the job of organizers is just to build relationships and pull in more people. But I would also say like, try and maybe take advantage. Okay, two things. One, make sure you can sustain yourself. Two, if you can't, like try and find ways to get funding. Three, if you are in a place where you can sustain yourself and don't need funding, maybe try and take advantage of the fact that you don't need funding to do things that groups that are funded and therefore are like more restricted, like can't do, because there's just like a lot of complications around the way that funding works. And a lot of times like some really cool stuff happens if you're like not as accountable, if you're able to be more accountable to like your community and each other, if that makes sense. So those are a few thoughts.
All right, we have another question. So people just want to know how they can begin to get involved. There's so many injustice organizations and campaigns out there. So I guess how do you know where to start?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And like, I know for me, like when my first year of college, I was like, I had done like track and cross country in high school and was like, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to like figure out how to change the world. But then like my first few weeks of college, I was like, I can't figure out where or how to do this. So then I just like did track and cross country for 2 years, which was fun. Like it was good because I just couldn't figure it out. And then like between my like second and third year of college, got like exposed to environmental organizing through like a student group that was doing really amazing organizing, and was like, whoa, I'm just super into this, and kind of like came back to Chicago for my junior year and was like, I'm so psyched. I'm going to start a group on my campus. I'm going to network with other groups. And it was like, it was like, basically, the climate movement had found a way to tap into my self-interest. And then I was like, this is my self-interest. And I just like did all the things, and, fumbled around a bit, but like, so anyway, I just want to acknowledge, one, it can be hard to figure out where to plug in. And yeah, time is like a huge issue, especially in the US. People have to work so much. There's like way less room to organize outside of that. But I would say just like start showing up for different organizations that you're interested in, and see what like feels good to you. And when opportunities to get involved happen, be like, yes, I can help phone bank. Yes, I can help with like, I know now is also a hard time because like organizing is changing so much based on what's going on with COVID, but just show up to different spaces, and the spaces that feel good, stick around and say yes to opportunities. And I realize, schedule can be a huge issue, and it's okay if it takes time. And then the final thing you said, it can seem like it's so hard to make a difference because everything seems so small. It's like we make a difference with a lot of small things. And as someone who like really relies on volunteers, I mean, I'm super grateful for the volunteers who spend 10, 20 hours a week on this, but I'm also super grateful for the volunteers who show up to 1 or 2 things a year when they can. Like each of those is really important because this is about like the impact we make together. So those are a few things I'd share. And also my email's there. So I'm super happy to chat with anyone with like follow-up questions about any of this, but especially if it's like, I'm just trying to figure out how to get involved. I'm happy to talk about that too.
Yeah, and we are also this is also being recorded. We will share the slides, but, you know, speaking of organizing right now in the time of COVID pandemic, a lot of things are transitioning to being virtual. And I guess, how do you continue the momentum that you've already established in your campaign with this crisis?
Yeah, so I think, okay, one is just recognizing sometimes you lose a little bit of momentum. I think right now we're at a spot where like a lot of our campaigns are having to pivot and figure out what's happening, and like a lot of times we don't know and we're figuring it out as we go. So my main answer is I don't know. But my other thing is like we do need to figure out how to pivot in the long term, like super long term, in terms of like this crisis exacerbates a lot of things that are really, really messed up with our society already. And we need to be thinking about like how to build relationships with each other so that we can like propose those solutions that are in the middle of the Venn diagram. So I'm thinking especially with like COVID recovery stuff, like we're gonna need a lot of economic stimulus, and thinking about like how can we work together on a local level, on a state level, on a national level with like groups that share our values and really want to take on some of these systemic issues to like make really big asks where environment is a part of it, but also like economic justice is a part of it, workers' rights is a part of it, racial justice is a part of it, ensuring healthcare access for everyone is a part of it. So I think like, yeah, my main thought is like in a lot of campaigns, we are going to lose momentum, but it's the slowing down so that we can build together and then get really big and powerful together. That's kind of, those are my initial thoughts. And then if you're like, but what does that mean on a micro scale? Like, what should I do with my people now? One, like just doing relationship building. Like I know like the Ready for 100 campaign had a movie night together, you know, where they watched a movie via Zoom. That seems great. And then also recognizing it's fine right now to be working on COVID response and recovery or like immediate action stuff. And it might not be directly related to your campaign, but if you're like, shoot, we need to like highlight that the EPA is not going to be enforcing pollution standards, like that might not be our immediate campaign right now, but really addressing that and raising issues around that is really important right now and will probably help our campaign in the long run. So those are some initial thoughts.
And speaking of relationship building, you know, happening right now, how do you set up one-on-one meetings with volunteers, potential volunteers? When should you have this type of opportunity, and like why should you have that one-on-one attention with volunteers?
Yeah, so you can do one-on-one meetings via phone or a Zoom call or Google Hangout. I've found this helpful, like the volunteer leaders I work with, I've just found it helpful to check in on like, how are they doing? You know, given that we're in a global pandemic, what are their needs right now from like the chapter in terms of resources that could support them? And then also just like talking to them about some of these big questions we were just talking about like, what does this mean for our campaign? How should we be pivoting? And like thinking through with volunteers, like what's going on in your community that Sierra Club can help support in the short term while we're not sure what's going on with our campaign, but that will like help make people's lives better in this crisis. So yeah, I think any type of relationship building is good, and phone and computers make it easier to do this than it would have been in the past.
Yes. Thank God for the internet.
Yeah.
At least for those who access it. So I have one more question, but if anyone else would like to get in there, you can still raise your hand or put it in the chat. We have a few minutes left on this webinar. To raise your hand on the phone, you just dial *9, but just kind of last call if people have any other questions before we close up. And possibly while someone is typing, you mentioned earlier how communities aren't monoliths in terms of relationship building and how you need the foundation for a successful campaign. Can you talk more to the importance of having a diverse coalition or diverse people working on your campaign plan?
For sure. So I guess when I said communities aren't monoliths, I didn't fully explain that, but I think the example I gave was like there were some organizations in like Pilsen Little Village that weren't gonna push hard on the corporations because they got money from them. But if we had just listened to those, you know, if we had only listened to those organizations, that would have been ignoring the organizations that are like, hi, we're organizing, trying to stop these, you know. And so it's complicated, but also just like, that is one example of how communities aren't monoliths. And yeah, having diverse coalitions is really important because, I mean, I think we gave like unfortunately, like the example we were talking about earlier with like COVID-19 and like the really inequitable impact it's having on the Black community versus, you know, other communities in Chicago. And like the people know their experiences best and know what solutions they need best. And so we need a lot of different perspectives at a coalition table to be able to know like what are the solutions we need to be proposing that are going to make people's lives better. And if we have, you know, if we don't have a representation across the board in a coalition, we're not going to be able to get those perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, and those perspectives are just really important, and especially in terms of how you do your work. I know right now, like youth organizing has been really impactful and powerful in moving the needle in terms of getting local, state, and federal work done for the climate crisis right now. And, you know, personally, as a person of color, it's really important to work in a coalition where I feel represented. This will not be like a token person there. So I'm just really speaking into that too. Like you do need a diverse group of people to do some great work. But we are closing up right now. And so thank you again, Caroline, for leading us through this. Thank you to everyone joining IEC for our Lunch Learn Series. We hope these sessions, will help keep our community connected during this difficult time. And we're also talking about even like COVID came up during this organizing work. So it's definitely in the back of everyone's minds. Again, these are publicly available, and if you're not already a member of IEC and are able to give, please consider joining today by using the link in the chat box that Tucker put in there. He also plugged our next Lunch and Learn, which is state recycling and composting tomorrow at noon. So, and with that, thank you everyone for joining, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye. Thanks for joining.
Bye.